On the other hand, we have a lot of boat traffic between the countries, and it is known that the flounder can be introduced via ballast water because it has been introduced to the Great Lakes in North America, where it did not establish a population. So answering this is outside of the scope of my PhD. But I was wondering, how do we continue from this? We have both these options, these possibilities, and depending on the answer, it would change how we can refer to the flounder. If it arrived naturally, we cannot really refer to it as an alien or even invasive species. So I decided to do some surveys. I wanted to know what specialists in the field think about this based on the knowledge that we have currently, and also what do stakeholders in Iceland think? Does it matter to them whether the flounder arrived naturally or whether it was introduced? So let's start with a specialist. I conducted a survey that I opened at a conference in 2022. We had quite a few participants from several countries. One of the questions was, based on what they've now learned through the survey, what term would they use for the flounder? And 67 people answered this, and I almost received as many answers. So I went and classified the answers based on whether they use terminology that referred to an actual introduction, an intermediate, like a mix, or whether it doesn't include any introduction at all. 58% did use terminology suggesting an introduction, such as alien, non-native, invasive. 21% used terminology that covers both, such as range-expanding species, cryptogenic, neonative. 13% used terminology such as species, new species, that do not include a human-induced introduction. And 8% were unsure. Then the survey to the stakeholders. I shared that mostly via Facebook. And one of the questions was, do you think it makes a difference whether the flounder arrived naturally or whether it arrived due to human influence? And out of the 188 answers, about 100 said it doesn't matter. Also, I gave them 6 actions of how to proceed in general and asked them to rank it in importance according to their opinion. And not very surprisingly, according to them, the most important step will be to figure out what effects does a flounder have on native species. Considering that these are mostly recreational anglers, not very surprising that they want to know if there's an impact on the native salmonids. What I was surprised and quite happy to see is that on a second place, they rank the prevention of the arrival of future potential invasive species. And moving on to the next research question, where's the flounder now? And that's a paper that's currently in preparation. Monitoring alien species is quite important. You need to know where are they and how did they spread. But often these kind of monitoring activities require a lot of resources, a lot of determination, which is often lacking or not dedicated, as is the case for the flounder. So I've become curious of whether we can use knowledge of stakeholders to contribute to the monitoring of alien species. And so I took a look at the data these are 2 of the questions of the paper. The first one, does the stakeholder knowledge offer an additional source in detecting the distribution? And I looked at the data that's available here at the MFRI, both the freshwater side and the marine side. And we can take a look at that. These are the sites where the flounder has been documented doing marine surveys. And then in the marine database, there's also the rare fish, where especially commercial fishermen have reported flounder, which are here shown in green, while the survey data was mostly focused around Faxafloy and Snæfellsnes. The rare fish data spans quite widely. And this is stakeholder knowledge. It was provided by people outside the institute. Looking at the freshwater, the surveys are mostly, again, in the west of Iceland. But then we have this outlier up here, a flounder caught last summer in Backaau, and represents the first flounder documented in the northeast of Iceland. And again, here we have in the freshwater database stakeholder knowledge or stakeholder data based on logbooks, where recreational fishermen are required by law to document salmon catches, but some of them went out of their way to also report flounder. And you can see it's quite a nice addition to the surveying data. And then I was, again curious, what do people know? So in 2019, I started an online survey specifically targeting the recreational fishing community in Iceland. And one of the questions was whether they have encountered flounder, seen or caught it. And these are the locations I received. And here I took a very conservative approach, only including those locations that I could for sure identify, with every other river being named Laxá. That wasn't always that easy, but still we have quite a wide range of locations. And then in a second step, I looked at what data was available online, what have people talked about, what locations have been named on Facebook. And this added another quite a few locations. So if we combine all of this together, we get quite a nice overview of the flounder distribution. And I think it's safe to say, while both approaches, stakeholder knowledge and scientific surveying, have advantages and disadvantages, I think the stakeholder knowledge is a nice contribution to monitoring of an alien species. So it is, yes, it is a great source of knowledge if carried out right. And then addressing the second question, whether stakeholder knowledge can also provide information on that can be used to recreate the temporal spread of an alien species. And here I looked at just the MFRI data. So I plotted them, or mapped the data points according to the year where they were documented. And here we have the survey data, the freshwater in black and the marine in gray. Both very clumped together in most parts. But what I really want to point out here is the stakeholder knowledge of the rare fish locations documented, which is in green, from here all the way up to here. So basically from the Westfjords along the south coast to the east, the flounder was already documented by 2003, which shows us quite a fast spread from 1999 when it was first documented down here in the southwest. So again, yes, stakeholder knowledge in this case has provided additional information on the temporal spread of flounder. And that leads me to my last paper, or in this case, it's actually my first paper. It's currently in review. I was very interested in connecting with the recreational fishing community and figuring out how do they perceive the flounder. So as I mentioned, in 2019, I conducted an online survey, and it was centered around 4 questions, and I asked them to rate their agreement to them, saying whether they think the flounder could be of recreational value, whether they think it has a negative impact on their own fishing experience or on other species, and whether they consider the flounder a pest. And, well, what can I say? Green marks agreement, brown disagreement, so overall the flounder is not very much liked in Iceland, or perceived highly negatively. That made me curious as to what drives this perception, and whether it is the species itself or it being new in Iceland. So I conducted a very similar survey in the species native range using the same questions, and you can see the results are completely flipped. In its native range, the flounder is perceived highly positive. People go specifically out to catch the flounder. They like the flounder, and I received many, "Why do you even ask this?" responses. And then in early 2023, as part of another project, I did yet another survey where I added the same questions again, because I was curious whether the perception among recreational fishermen here in Iceland have changed in those 3.5 years. And you can see that the pattern overall has remained quite similar, but statistical comparisons have shown that the responses to all 4 questions have changed significantly towards less negative. So yeah, overall it has changed over time. Around that time, while I was conducting that research, I was introduced to the concept of conservation culturomics. So culturomics is a field where they look at human behavior and cultural trends and how this is manifested in web-based data. And in conservation culturomics specifically, they focus on the human-nature interaction. It's a great field, has proven very successful, but many challenges remain, including the validity of the data. So we wanted to take the case of the flounder and use it as a validation study, because I was directly interacting with the stakeholders through the survey and compare that data to what we can find online, what has manifested online. So I spent a lot of time at my laptop looking at first at how was the flounder communicated to the public by looking at all newspaper articles on the flounder that either were focusing on it or mentioning it, and manually extracted that data from the website timarit.is. And in a second step, I was interested in how was the flounder communicated within the stakeholder group. And conservation culturomics often uses platforms such as Twitter, like Twitter conversations, and how was it communicated there. Didn't really work out for the flounder in Iceland on Twitter, so we used Facebook instead, and again, a lot of manual work. And so here you see both the newspaper articles as well as the Facebook conversations, split into focus and mentioning. And we split it in 3 timeframes, from 1999 to 2013, when the Facebook group was opened, and then 2013 to October 2019, when I started my PhD, and then since October 2019. In addition to the quantitative data that I took here, I extracted the qualitative data, so all the textual data. What I would have really liked to do is a so-called sentiment analysis, so looking at how positive or negative is a text formulated and how does it change over time. But given that Icelandic is not the most popular language in the world, those tools are not yet available for Icelandic. So we opted for a word frequency approach and first used a topic analysis. This analysis basically takes all the text data together, analyzes and identifies topics that occur within based on words co-occurring together. In this case, it was the arrival and spread of flounder in Iceland in red, the general monitoring and surveying in green, as well as flounder and recreational angling in blue. And then it takes these topics and looks at each specific source and time frame as to how often or how prominent these topics were. And the upper row here are the newspaper articles, A being before 2013, where the arrival and spread of flounder was the most talked about. In the second one, B, between 2013 and October 2019, the flounder took a backseat, and the more prominent topic was the general monitoring and surveying. But since 2019, it shifted towards flounder in recreational angling. D and E down here are the Facebook conversations, and unsurprisingly, the most prominent topics across both timelines is flounder in recreational angling. Then we also looked at word frequencies in general, what words were used, trying to see if positive, negative words were coming up, and in the end, it didn't really show any specific negativity in the results. So these novel approaches that we applied did not really capture this highly negative perception that we documented through the surveys, which in terms of the newspapers is less surprising because it just might be that to the public it was much more neutrally communicated. What did surprise me though, that within the conversations between the stakeholders, that the negativity didn't quite come through, because in the surveys we targeted this group and it was mostly advertised through the specific Facebook group that we analyzed. So I would have expected at least some level of similarity. But this can also be driven and highlights a limitation of conservation culturomics, which is applying it in non-English speaking countries, and especially small countries. All of these factors which could have contributed to the mismatch. And with that, I'm gonna stop and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Do you have any questions? I have one. Pink salmon. That's the next species, right?
I wish.
How should I word this question? Having gone through all this for the flounder, what is the recommendation to the MFRI on how we should monitor or survey pink salmon that is now arriving? And another question on pink salmon. It was introduced to Russia, but is coming to Iceland. Would you say, if I mirror your first question to the specialists, is pink salmon arriving here as an introduced species, or is it arriving as like the first question you asked to this?
Let's start with that one. I would classify it as an alien, or in this case invasive species, because it was introduced without human influence. It wouldn't have come to Western Russia and then consequently spread further. And your first question, I think a big recommendation would be communicate and collaborate with recreational anglers, like establish some incentive for people to report their findings and make it easier. If looking at the online system of recording of the logbooks, it currently gives you the 3 salmonid species and then another option that isn't really providing much opportunity to say which species you've caught, whether it was flounder, whether it was pink salmon. And even if you would enter how many, there's no way of adding this information. So I think us as scientists, when we go into the rivers or sampling, we get probably a much more detailed information of what we see, whether it's depth or anything, the size of the fish. But there's only a limited amount of time we spend there, whereas such as like stakeholder groups such as they spend so much time out there. They might not be able to say how big that species was or in what salinity it occurred, but they will be able to tell you what has changed over time, where have they seen a fish, and I think that's very valuable knowledge that could be used without requiring a lot of resources.
Já, Binni, spurning á Teams. Heyrist ekki dýp inna. Það okkur að kenna? Okkur heyrist ekki dýp inna. Adda, prófa þú að tala? Eða einhver annar þarna online? Birkir, það heyrist ekkert. Nei, þetta er vandamál í okkur þá. Binni, prófa núna.
Núna?
Já, örlítið. Þannig þetta að koma.
Okay. Að heyra aðrir, okay.
Ok, komið, Binni, skjóttu.
Hello, Theresa. Thank you for your talk. I enjoyed it. We have this interest in flundra in common, and this addition that you brought to us, the genetic, what should I say, the new genetic research that was completed, and we have seen the results, and that the Faroese flounder is there between, and this supports that the flounder came here naturally. And there is one other point that you didn't mention. That is that the flounder also came rather late to Faroe Islands. But to my knowledge, it came there in the middle of the 20th century. So it was also inhabiting the islands there and was migrating from Europe before that time. So that was my question. Oh. What do you say about this?
Fair question. First of all, I'm not entirely sure when the flounder arrived in the Faroe Islands. The only records I could find was from a book in 1958, Towning, I think, referring to the flounder as a native species. But could be that it was relatively recent before that. I'm not entirely sure. As to the assumption that the flounder must have arrived naturally, I don't agree with that. I wouldn't exclude the possibility of flounder having arrived, of some flounder having arrived and crossed that distance. But there's so many factors that to me speak against a sufficient amount of flounder arriving naturally, crossing these 400 kilometers to then sustain this rapid spread that we have seen in the flounder. And based on the literature and observations, the flounder doesn't travel that far. It doesn't necessarily travel far above deep waters. And neither in Iceland nor in the Faroe Islands, it is not very often caught in marine surveys. So something doesn't quite add up to me there. Whereas for ballast water, we do have the proof that the flounder can be introduced via ballast water. We have seen that. It has been documented for North America. And so that is, to me, a more likely explanation. But again, I wouldn't exclude either option.
Theresa, keep in mind also that part of the life cycle, the larva is actually it's in the surface layer for several weeks, and there it could easily been carried by surface currents with the weather. Could be carried for quite some distances.
Again, I agree. That is very well known, and I mentioned that earlier. The oceanography, as far as I have seen, points out that the surface currents are going from Iceland to the Faroe Islands. So I'm not an oceanographer by any way, so there might also be a lot of things that I don't know there, but again, that doesn't seem very likely to me. But also...
Thank you. Yeah.
Lots of questions.
It will be an interesting future, and that's what research are. Yeah. Thank you for your input.
Thank you for your question.
Thank you, Theresa. Thank you, Theresa, for interesting talk. I'm Jonas at the Institute. So, species dealing with similar kind of waters. We have, I've been studying nephrops, and I was part of a paper that was studying kind of the nephros populations around the British Isles and North Sea and Iceland. And there we find that the genetic difference between Breiðamerkurdýpi in the southeast and areas west of the west of Ireland, they are kind of the same populations. But they see difference between those populations west of Ireland and others in the North Sea, kind of suggesting there is a larval drift from Nephrops area west of Ireland to southeast of Iceland. And we have seen many species, especially since 96, 97, there was spread of quite a lot of invertebrate crab species. We saw a lot of Cancer pagurus we saw some other interesting crab species quite a lot in Iceland. And then we also have kind of the connections regarding monkfish on the Hatton Rockall and Iceland, and then also kind of that we have the parental fish going back there. So there is connection between. I would not exclude it. I would assume it to be maybe highly likely that this had occurred, and maybe that we missed maybe the first step of the flounder in southeast Iceland, where you also have scarcolli inhabiting maybe coastal estuary. So of course we can't exclude that it came by ballast, but I would say it's highly likely that this possibility, because we see it in other species. So, and I also like that how you can track just a note, how you can track kind of the people mind, they are a little bit positive to flounders, or maybe more anglers have been trying to cook it. So maybe it's a good addition. I'm not sure, but it's funny how this is difference between Iceland and, of course, it is kind of introduced as a negative one, and it is most likely, is having a negative effect in the rivers. And maybe that's my kind of follow-up question. How has that been quantified, the negative effect of the flounder in the rivers?
Well, where do I start? Again, I agree that I don't exclude the option of the flounder arriving naturally, and I would love to read that paper. I'm going to look that up. Again, there's also a lot of things that I don't know, and I will look closer into that. And the change, Again, what was your second question? Sorry.
The rivers,
Yes, okay.
What have you seen, or has anything been documented? Have people documented the negative impact in the rivers? Because,
well, there has been very little done on the flounder. There have been some small-scale studies. There has been a master thesis down in Borgarfjörður, Kvítá, and one up in the Westfjords, both of them indicating a competition or likelihood of competition between flounder and salmonids, both via competition for food as well as direct predation. But and there have been some small-scale studies looking into the diet in Hlíðarvatn, and but it hasn't, there is indication that there might be impact, but it's not enough to quantify the impact, unfortunately.
Okay, Sigurður Þór Jónsson at Hafró. Thank you, Theresa, for an interesting talk. On the dispersion or colonization issue that is a part of your study, you talk about ballast water. Is it a sort of a collective term, or does the seawater cooling of pelagic fleets add some sort of dimension to it that you have considered? They are fish. Icelandic pelagic boats have quite liberal access to Faroese waters, I could say. But and if they were fishing during larval dispersal, or some maybe vagrants going out of the Faroes.
Might be.
Yeah. Okay.
I also know of, I've been told from people who, I don't remember what they were fishing for, but some catches were low, so they ended up going towards the Faroe Islands to catch flatfish. There are a lot of different options and factors that would need to be considered to have a final answer for this.
Yeah, and then I would like to mention the sprat. as also a colonizer. That should be studied.
Many things should be studied.
Now I have to say sorry, Theresa, but I want to ask Siggi. So ballast waters in my mind is something that you use in the bottom of the ship, but what were you talking about? Cooling waters in the pelagic fleet. Can you explain it a little bit?
I can try. I mean, pelagic trawling or purse-seining catches more pelagics often, and they are put into the hold and they are cooled with seawater taken on the spot where they are caught, I guess. Yeah, that would be my suggestion. I'm not familiar with the process. It will be dried out a bit before they start pumping. I don't know. It goes out into the site of landing, I would imagine. I'm not an expert on that. And then there was we had freezing vessels, but they weren't all that many. But there has been a change in the fleet towards almost exclusively seawater cooling. Mm-hmm. And they can get more time then.
Thank you for this, Siggi. Are there any final questions? Yep.
Hi, I'm interested in how, because you talk about people being positive towards the flounder in Europe, mm-hmm. And are people fishing this or cooking and they like it?
Yeah.
So why don't we just do it also?
I've tried convincing people. I even went on London to cook the flounder. I don't know if that made a change, but yeah, like in the native range, it's often expressed that the flounder is a fun fish to catch, or especially for beginners, it's readily available in relatively nearshore waters. It's a good beginner's fish, but also, I've been told, puts up a good fight. And especially around the Baltic Sea, people also really like eating it. And I mean, it's by no means any comparable to cod or anything, but people like it. And yeah, here people just haven't caught on to that, I guess.
Okay, so you can take it with a net or a fly fish or...
yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Can I follow up? Interesting question. So the beginners are catching it with rods or okay, you're talking about beginners like that.
Yeah.
In terms of okay.
I've been told like people would take their children to catch flounder or.
Yeah, in open access areas, right?
Yeah, like throughout the native range, the angling is slightly different. It's more also in coastal areas outside of the rivers, and there it's easily accessible.
So if I
or shore angling,
excuse myself again and try to answer your question. I mean, there's a huge difference between people catching it here. They are usually catching it when they have paid a lot of money to catch something else.
And it's not as pretty as a big salmon to put on Instagram.
All right. Thank you again, Theresa.
Thank you.